Lydia Abernathy had traveled 2,000 miles to begin her life as a bride. She arrived instead a mourner. The final leg of the journey in a rattling stagecoach had deposited her on the dusty platform of Havenwood Creek, Montana Territory, a place that felt more like the edge of the world than the beginning of a new life. The air, thin and smelling of pine and dust, was a stark contrast to the damp, gray civility of Boston she had left behind in the spring of 1881. The town was a raw, unfinished sketch of a community, a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, all huddled beneath a sky of shocking, almost violent blue. This was to be her home, this and the Pendleton Ranch beyond it. Lydia clutched her worn reticule, the letters from Mr. Arthur Pendleton tucked safely inside. His words had been the anchor in the turbulent sea of her family's ruin, a promise of stability for a respectable, if plain, 22-year-old woman with no prospects. Now, standing on the splintered planks of the station platform, a profound sense of dislocation washed over her. She was scanning the sparse crowd for a man matching Arthur's description, 42, tall, with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair, when a boy of about 12, his face smudged with dirt, approached her, cap in hand. "Ma'am, are you Miss Abernathy?" "Yes, I am," she replied, a wave of relief steadying her nerves. "I'm Finn. Mr. Pendleton sent me to fetch you," the boy said, gesturing to a sturdy but weathered wagon. Then he hesitated, shuffling his worn boots in the dust. "He couldn't come himself. He's laid up." The conflict of her entire journey crystallized into a single cold knot in Lydia's stomach. "Laid up? Is he ill?" Finn wouldn't meet her eyes. "Got shot in the leg, ma'am, in a tussle with some rustlers. Doc Miller says he'll mend, but he can't ride just yet." Shot. The word hung in the air, blunt and brutal. It was a word from dime novels, not from the careful, considerate letters she had received. "Welcome to the West," she thought grimly. The ride to the ranch was a jarring, mostly silent affair. The landscape was vast and intimidating, the mountains looming like ancient, sleeping giants. Yet as they crested a final rise, the Pendleton Ranch came into view, and a small gasp escaped Lydia's lips. It was a proper two-story house, painted white, with a wide porch and sturdy outbuildings. It looked solid, peaceful. It looked like a home. For the first time in weeks, a fragile tendril of hope unfurled within her. As the wagon rolled to a stop in the yard, a man emerged from the shadows of the porch. Her heart gave a hopeful leap. Arthur? But the hope died as quickly as it was born. This man was younger, perhaps 30, with the broad shoulders and lean frame of someone who lived a life of hard physical labor. Dark, unruly hair fell across his brow, and as he stood, she noticed a distinct, subtle limp in his right leg. A gun belt with a holstered Colt revolver rested low on his hips with an ease that spoke of long familiarity. "This is Miss Abernathy," Finn called out, his voice sounding small in the vast quiet. The stranger approached, removing his hat. His face was tanned and weathered, etched with fine lines that suggested he might smile often, though he wasn't smiling now. His eyes, a startling piercing blue, studied her with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as if he could see all the way back to the desperation that had put her on that train in Boston. "Miss Abernathy," he said, his voice a low baritone, rough around the edges like unpolished stone. "I'm Jedediah Stone. Folks call me Jed. Welcome to the Pendleton Ranch." Lydia looked from his serious face to the silent house, confusion warring with a rising sense of dread. I don't understand. Where is Mr. Pendleton?" A shadow passed over Jed Stone's face, a flicker of profound, weary sadness. He looked at her directly, his blue eyes holding a mixture of sympathy and something else she couldn't quite define. "I'm afraid I have difficult news, ma'am," he said, his voice dropping. "Arthur Pendleton passed away 3 days ago. The wound became infected. There was nothing the doctor could do." The world beneath Lydia's feet seemed to dissolve into dust. The sturdy porch, the vast sky, the solemn man before her, a horror. It all tilted and blurred. She gripped the hard edge of the wagon seat, her knuckles white, the only solid thing in a universe that had just shattered. Dead. The man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry was dead. Her future, the lifeline she had clung to, had snapped. "So, what am I to do now?" she whispered, the question not directed at him, but at the empty, indifferent air. She was a bride without a groom, A stranger thousands of miles from anything she knew, with no money to return. Jed Stone seemed to understand the depth of her despair. He stepped forward and offered his hand, a large, calloused hand that looked capable of both immense strength and surprising gentleness. "For now," he said, his voice firm but kind, "you'll stay here." As she numbly placed her hand in his to be helped down from the wagon, the shocking climax of her arrival was delivered not with a shout, but with a quiet, unbelievable statement. "Before he died, Arthur had the judge come out from town," Jed continued, his gaze steady. "He changed his will." He paused, letting the weight of his next word settle. "He left the ranch, all of it, to you." Lydia stared at him, the words failing to form a coherent thought. "To me? But we weren't married. He didn't even know me." "He said it was the proper thing to do," Jed explained, his expression unreadable. "He'd brought you all this way, and he wouldn't see you left stranded. He asked me to look after things, to look after you." He nodded to Finn to start unloading her trunk. "We can figure out the rest later. You must be tired from your journey." As he turned to lead her toward the house, Lydia stood frozen in the yard. She was no longer a mail-order bride with a clear, if daunting, purpose. She was an heiress by default, the unwilling owner of a grieving house, a vast and intimidating landscape, and she was now irrevocably tied to the silent, haunted man who had just delivered her entire, unbelievable future into her hands. A house is not a home until someone breathes life into it, and Lydia Abernathy decided then and there, standing in the cold, dusty parlor, that she would not let this one die along with its master. The hook of her new reality was sharp and painful. She was an owner, not a bride, and her inheritance was a place steeped in grief. The interior of the Pendleton ranch house was a portrait of a life abruptly ended. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of afternoon light, settling on solid, well-made furniture. A layer of grime covered the windows, and the hearth in the massive stone fireplace was cold, filled with gray ash. The house didn't feel empty. It felt abandoned, as if its very soul had departed with Arthur Pendleton, leaving behind only a hollow, silent shell. The setting was a physical manifestation of the foreman's heart, functional, strong, but devoid of warmth and light. Jed Stone, after showing her to the upstairs room Arthur had prepared for her, a room ironically filled with welcoming touches like a new quilt and a vase of wilting wildflowers, retreated into himself. He was a ghost in his own domain. He would disappear before dawn, working the vast lands with a relentless energy that seemed fueled by a desire to outrun his own thoughts. He returned long after sunset, his face etched with a deeper weariness each day, ate the simple meal she prepared in a shared, heavy silence, and then retreated to his small quarters above the stable. He was a man avoiding the house and, by extension, avoiding her. The central conflict for Lydia was not just her grief or her precarious situation, but the suffocating inertia of the house and the cold indifference of the man who was now her reluctant partner. She needed to find her place in this silent world, to prove to him and to herself that she was not another burden, another tragedy to be endured. She had to fight the encroaching shadows, both literal and metaphorical. Her rising action began not with words, but with work. Raised in a home where order and cleanliness were next to godliness, Lydia could not abide the slow decay. She started in the kitchen, scrubbing the soot from the stove until it shone, polishing the tarnished silver, and organizing the pantry. She aired out the musty linens and beat the dust from the heavy drapes. The house began to breathe again. She found Arthur's study, a room filled with books on agriculture, history, and poetry. As she dusted the shelves, she began to piece together a portrait of the man she was meant to marry. He was intelligent, thoughtful, and possessed a quiet love for the land. It was a discovery that brought a fresh pang of sorrow, a grief for a future she hadn't known she wanted until it was gone. She began to cook in earnest, using the recipes she found in a small, handwritten book on the kitchen counter. The scent of fresh baked bread, of simmering stews, began to fill the cold, quiet corners of the house. It was an aroma of life, a stark contrast to the scent of dust and sorrow that had greeted her upon her arrival. Jed's reaction was subtle, almost imperceptible. He never commented on the clean floors or the organized pantry. But she noticed that he started eating more, his plate clean after every meal. One evening, she found a neatly stacked pile of freshly chopped firewood by the hearth, a silent acknowledgement, a wordless thank you. The house was changing, and perhaps so was he. The climax of this silent truce arrived a week into her stay. While cleaning Arthur's study, Lydia had found his ledgers. Driven by a practical need to understand her new responsibilities, she began to go through them. The numbers told a story of a ranch struggling against drought and falling cattle prices. As she sat at Arthur's desk, a furrow of concentration on her brow, the front door opened. Jed was back from the range hours earlier than usual, his face grim. He stopped dead in the doorway of the study, seeing her there, surrounded by Arthur's private papers. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice low and sharp, with a mixture of suspicion and a raw, protective anger. It was the most emotion he had shown since her arrival. For a moment, fear pricked at her. She was an intruder, a stranger meddling in the affairs of the dead. But then her own resolve hardened. She looked up from the ledger, her gaze meeting his without flinching. "I'm trying to save our home," she said, her emphasis on the word "our" deliberate and unwavering. She gestured to an open page. "According to this, we're behind on our payment to the feed supplier, and the contract for the fall cattle sale was never finalized. We are in more trouble than you've let on." The resolution was a tense, charged silence. Jed stared at her, his initial anger giving way to a grudging respect. He had seen her as a delicate woman from the East, a problem left for him to solve. He had not expected a partner. He walked over to the desk, his limp more pronounced, and looked down at the figures she was pointing to. He couldn't deny the truth in her assessment, nor the intelligence in her eyes. The transition to a new dynamic was sealed in that moment. He pulled up a second chair. "Show me what you found," he said. For the first time, they were not a grieving foreman and an unexpected heiress. They were two partners staring down a shared and uncertain future. The question now was not whether she would stay, but whether together they could possibly succeed. Vultures, Lydia knew from the books she'd read, always circle when they sense a weakening. In Havenwood Creek, the largest vulture flew under the guise of a gentleman and went by the name of Silas Croft. He arrived at the ranch a week later, his polished black buggy a stark, predatory contrast to the rustic landscape. This was the hook, the arrival of a new, more tangible threat, one that made their financial troubles seem almost manageable by comparison. The setting of this encounter was the front porch of the Pendleton Ranch, a space that Lydia had just begun to reclaim from its shroud of grief. She had placed a pot of hardy chrysanthemums near the door, a small but defiant splash of color. It was on this porch, a symbolic threshold between the private world she and Jed were building and the harsh realities outside, that their first battle would be fought. The antagonist, Silas Croft, was a man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place in the dusty territory. He was handsome in a severe way, with silvering temples and eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. He exuded an air of affable, predatory confidence, a man who believed the world was his for the taking. The central conflict was immediately clear. Croft had long coveted the Pendleton Ranch for its prime water rights, and Arthur's death, coupled with the arrival of an inexperienced woman from the East, was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He came not just to make an offer, but to assert his dominance and probe for weakness. The rising action began with Croft's disingenuous condolences. He dismounted, sweeping his hat from his head with a flourish. "Miss Abernathy," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "A terrible tragedy. Arthur was a pillar of this community." Jed emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his face an impassive mask, though Lydia could see the tension in his shoulders. He positioned himself on the porch steps, a silent, formidable guardian. Croft's eyes flickered toward Jed with dismissal before returning to Lydia. "A great burden has fallen upon your young shoulders," he continued, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "A woman alone cannot possibly manage an operation of this size." He then made his offer, a sum that sounded generous, but which Lydia, having studied Arthur's ledgers, knew was significantly below the land's true value. Jed answered before she could. "The ranch isn't for sale, Croft." His voice was flat and hard. Croft laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. He ignored Jed completely, his focus entirely on Lydia, clearly identifying her as the weak link. "Mr. Stone is loyal, but perhaps not a businessman. I, on the other hand, can offer you a clean break, a chance to return to the civilization you're accustomed to, with your pockets full." This was the climax of the confrontation. All of Croft's assumptions, that she was weak, ignorant, and eager to flee, were laid bare. Lydia felt a surge of cold fury. She stepped forward, positioning herself beside Jed, presenting a united front. "This is my home now, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and steady, echoing with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "And it is not for sale." The resolution of the scene was the sudden, startling shift in Croft's demeanor. The charming facade vanished, replaced by a chillingly direct threat. His eyes narrowed. "Everything in this valley has a price, Miss Abernathy, and I always get what I want." He shot a final venomous look at Jed. "Be careful what you're trying to hold on to. Sometimes the harder you grip, the more you stand to lose." With that, he turned, climbed back into his buggy, and was gone, leaving a trail of dust and a palpable sense of menace in his wake. The transition from this chapter to the next was cemented in the silence that followed. Lydia and Jed stood together on the porch, the shared threat forging their reluctant partnership into a true alliance. "He won't stop," Jed said, his voice a low growl. "Then we must be ready," Lydia replied, her fear now eclipsed by a steely resolve. They were no longer just trying to survive their circumstances. They were now preparing to defend their home against a common enemy. They had officially become a team. The West, Lydia quickly learned, did not teach its lessons in a classroom. It taught them in the sting of a rope burn, the ache of muscles she didn't know she had, and the humbling fall from the back of a horse. This was the chapter's hook, the beginning of her transformation from an heiress on paper to a rancher in practice. The setting shifted to the working heart of the ranch, the dusty corral, the sprawling pastures under the vast Montana sky, and the windy ridges where fences always seemed to need mending. This landscape was no longer just a backdrop. It was her new school, and its curriculum was survival. Jed, reluctantly at first, became her teacher. He was a man of action, not words. His instruction blunt and practical. Lydia, in turn, became his unlikely student. She traded her city dresses for sturdy denim skirts and her grief for a stubborn, unyielding determination. The characters were now defined by their new roles, the stern mentor and the determined apprentice. The central conflict of the chapter was Lydia's struggle to overcome her own inexperience and physical limitations. She had to prove to Jed, and more importantly, to herself, that she could be more than just the woman who managed the books. She needed to become a true partner, someone who understood the land not just as an asset, but as a living, breathing entity. The rising action began with Croft's first moves. As Jed had predicted, the pressure started subtly. Their usual grain supplier in town suddenly claimed a shortage. A section of fence in the remote west pasture was found cut. A few head of cattle scattered. These were not disasters, but they were warnings. "I need to understand it all," Lydia announced one morning, her jaw set with determination. "Not just the numbers, the work." She started with the horses. Jed, with a sigh that suggested he thought it a waste of time, agreed to teach her to ride properly, not side saddle, but astride, like a woman who meant business. Her first lessons were a series of clumsy, painful encounters with the ground. Every evening, she would soak her bruised limbs in a hot bath, but every morning, she was back in the corral before he was. Jed's initial reluctance slowly morphed into a grudging respect. He saw that she did not complain, that her spirit was tougher than her soft hands. He began to teach her more, how to mend a fence so it would hold against the wind, how to spot the early signs of sickness in a calf, how to read the clouds for a coming storm. He was a patient, if not gentle teacher, and she was a quick, attentive student. The climax of her education arrived on a cold, windswept afternoon. A young cow was struggling with a difficult birth, her calf breeched. The vet was a day's ride away, and the cow was weakening. Jed worked with a grim, focused intensity, but it was clear he was preparing for the worst. "We're gonna lose them both," he said, his voice flat with the hard-won acceptance of a rancher who knew the cruelties of nature. But Lydia, who had been devouring Arthur's books on animal husbandry, remembered a passage. It described a difficult but sometimes successful technique for turning a breeched calf. It was a long shot, a theory from a book against the harsh reality before them. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. "Let me help. There's something we can try." Jed looked at her, his face a mask of exhaustion and doubt. "This isn't a book, Lydia. This is life and death." "Please," she insisted, her eyes pleading. "Trust me." Looking at her, this determined, intelligent woman who refused to give up, he saw not a liability, but an asset. With a curt nod, he acquiesced. The resolution was a tense, messy, and ultimately miraculous success. Following the book's instructions, with Lydia's clear-headed guidance and Jed's steady, powerful hands, they managed to save both the mother and her calf. They stood together in the aftermath, covered in mud and sweat, the tiny new life taking its first shaky breaths at their feet. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. Jed looked at Lydia not as the woman he was bound by a promise to protect, but as an equal partner who had just saved a life his own experience had already written off. The last barrier of professional distance between them had crumbled. The transition to a new phase in their relationship was sealed as they walked back to the house in the fading light. Their hands accidentally brushed against each other. This time, neither of them pulled away. A new awareness, a current of attraction as undeniable as the wind sweeping through the valley, now flowed between them. They had proven they could save the ranch together. The question now was what they would do with the feelings they were starting to save for each other. To save the future, Lydia was beginning to understand. You first had to reckon with the past. For Jedediah Stone, the city of Cheyenne was not just a place on a map, it was a ghost. This was the chapter's hook. A journey not just across the territory, but into the heart of Jed's guarded history. The setting expanded dramatically, shifting from the familiar confines of the ranch to the vast, unforgiving landscape of the trail between Montana and Wyoming. The trail itself was a character, dusty, dangerous, and beautiful. It was a space that stripped away pretense, forcing travelers into a raw and honest codependence. This was followed by the bustling, chaotic city of Cheyenne, a hub of commerce and vice, a place where fortunes were made and lives were broken. Lydia, now months into her new life, had evolved. She presented herself not as a damsel in distress, but as a determined ranch owner, ready to conduct business. Jed, in contrast, became more withdrawn and tense the closer they got to Cheyenne, his usual quiet confidence replaced by a haunted watchfulness. His past was a tangible presence between them. The central conflict was twofold. Externally, they faced a critical business challenge. They had to successfully sell their modest herd of cattle and secure a contract for the following year to finally put the ranch on solid financial footing. Internally, Lydia had to navigate the emotional minefield of Jed's past, a past that held the key to understanding the man he was. The rising action began with Lydia's resolute decision. Having studied Arthur's ledgers, she knew the annual trip to the Cheyenne cattle market was the financial linchpin of the entire operation. "I'm going," she announced, not asking for permission, "and I need you with me." Jed's reluctance was palpable. "It's a long, hard ride. Cheyenne is no place for a lady." "I am not a lady," Lydia countered, her voice firm. "I am a rancher, and you are my partner." Her logic was unassailable. The long days on the trail forged a new, deeper intimacy between them. They shared meals cooked over a crackling campfire and took turns standing watch under a canopy of stars. The formal roles of owner and foreman dissolved into the simple, essential reality of two people relying on each other for survival. Jed taught her how to navigate by the stars. She read to him from one of Arthur's books by the firelight. In Cheyenne, the city's raw energy was a shock to Lydia's senses. It was a world of powerful cattle barons, sharp-eyed merchants, and rough men looking for trouble. Jed guided her through it with a grim expertise, but she noticed he steered them clear of certain streets, his hand often resting near the butt of his Colt. The business negotiations were a trial by fire. Lydia, armed with the knowledge from Arthur's ledgers and Jed's quiet coaching on the tells of each buyer, held her own. She was polite but firm, refusing to be intimidated by the powerful men across the table. She not only secured a fair price for their cattle, but also negotiated a favorable contract for the next year, earning the grudging respect of the cattle barons and a look of profound pride from Jed. The climax of the chapter was not in the boardroom, but on a quiet, dusty side street. With their business concluded, Lydia was walking back to the hotel when she saw Jed standing frozen, staring at a small, unassuming house with faded blue shutters. His face was a mask of such raw, unguarded pain that it stole her breath. She approached him gently. "Jed, what is it?" He didn't seem to hear her at first. Then his voice, rough and thick with unshed tears, finally gave his ghosts a name. "This was my home," he said, his gaze fixed on the house. Before Arthur, I lived here with my wife, Elena, and our little girl, Rose." He finally turned to look at her, his blue eyes filled with a desolation that pierced her to the core. "They both died in this house," he whispered. "Typhoid fever 3 years ago. I was on a trail drive. By the time I got back, they were gone. Buried." The resolution was not in words, but in a simple, profound gesture. Lydia reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. She didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences. She simply stood with him in his grief, her presence a silent testament that he was no longer alone. She shared her own story of loss, of the Johnstown flood, of the sudden, brutal emptiness. In that moment, they weren't just partners. They were survivors, two souls bound by the common, tragic language of loss. The transition back to the ranch was different. The silence in the wagon was no longer one of awkwardness, but of deep, shared understanding. Jed was no longer just a mysterious foreman. He was a man who had loved and lost profoundly. And Lydia knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that she was no longer just his partner. She was falling in love with him. Nature does not care for the plans of men, nor for the fragile new feelings of the human heart. The hook for this chapter was the howl of a rising wind, a sound that promised to bury everything beneath a blanket of white, including the careful distance Lydia and Jed still maintained. The setting contracted violently, shrinking from the vast open trail to the claustrophobic confines of a tiny one-room line shack. This small, isolated cabin, a temporary shelter for cowboys riding the far ranges, became a crucible. It was a space so small it left no room for secrets or pretense, where the cold outside forced a reliance on the warmth of another. The characters, stripped of their familiar roles at the ranch, were reduced to their most essential selves. They were no longer owner and foreman, but simply a man and a woman fighting for survival. Their dependence on one another, once a matter of business, was now a matter of life and death. The central conflict was elemental, man versus nature. A sudden, violent blizzard descended upon them on their journey home from Cheyenne. But this external conflict served to ignite the internal one. With nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, they were forced to confront the powerful, unspoken emotions that had been growing between them. The rising action began as a change in the air. On the second day of their return journey, the sky turned a leaden gray, and the wind developed a sharp, biting edge. Jed, reading the signs with an experienced eye, urged them forward. "We need to reach the line shack at Bear Creek before this hits," he said, his voice grim. "It's our only chance." They rode hard, the first snowflakes beginning to swirl around them. But the storm came on faster than even he had anticipated, a furious, blinding wall of white that descended from the mountains and swallowed the world. Visibility dropped to near zero. The trail disappeared. They found the line shack more by Jed's instinct than by sight, a dark, solid shape materializing out of the swirling snow just as dusk began to fall. They stumbled inside, half frozen and exhausted, and worked together with a seamless, desperate efficiency. He secured the horses in the small lean-to. She fought to start a fire in the stone hearth with numb fingers. The small cabin became their entire world, a tiny bubble of flickering light and warmth against the raging blizzard. The wind shrieked around the log walls like a hungry beast. Trapped and isolated, they shared the last of their trail rations and huddled near the fire, the forced proximity creating an intimacy that was both comforting and dangerously charged. The climax of the chapter was not a dramatic action, but a moment of quiet, life-altering desperation. As the night wore on and the temperature inside the cabin plummeted, Lydia began to shiver uncontrollably, her lips turning a faint blue. The early signs of hypothermia were setting in. Jed, watching her with a growing panic in his eyes, knew that the fire alone wasn't enough. He made a decision. He took the rough wool blankets, wrapped them around her, and then, without a word, pulled her into his arms, enveloping her in his own body heat. She was stiff at first, but then relaxed into his embrace, her shivering slowly subsiding. In the profound silence, broken only by the storm and their own breathing, he rested his chin on the top of her head. "I can't lose anyone else, Lydia," he whispered, the confession raw and torn from the deepest part of his soul. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was a testament to his fear, to the ghosts of his past rising up in the face of a new potential loss. The resolution was her response. Safe in his arms, the life-giving warmth of his body seeping into hers, Lydia felt the last of her own reservations melt away. She tilted her head back to look at him in the dim firelight. "You won't," she said, her voice soft but certain. "You won't lose me." It was a vow, a promise made in the heart of a storm. The transition to the next stage of their story was sealed in that shared moment of survival. The blizzard raged on outside, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm had passed. When the sun rose the next morning, on a world transformed, they would emerge not as they had entered, but as two people who had faced death together and found, in each other's arms, a reason to live. Returning home after the storm, they discovered a new kind of silence. The hook was this profound, awkward quiet that filled the spacious ranch house. It was a silence louder and more difficult to navigate than the howl of the blizzard they had just survived. They had shared a life-altering intimacy in the line shack, but now, back in the world of separate rooms and defined roles, they didn't know how to be with each other. The setting was once again the Pendleton Ranch, but the atmosphere had changed. The house, which Lydia had filled with warmth and order, now felt charged with an unspoken electric tension. The corral, the barn, the wide-open pastures, all the familiar spaces seemed to amplify the new, awkward distance between them. The characters retreated into themselves, their shared vulnerability in the storm now replaced by a mutual uncertainty. Lydia busied herself with the ledgers, creating an armor of numbers and tasks. Jed threw himself into the harshest physical labor he could find, his actions a clear attempt to exhaust attention that had no other outlet. He was once again the stoic foreman, and she, the respectable owner, but the roles felt like ill-fitting costumes. The central conflict was no longer about survival, but about courage of a different kind. After the forced intimacy of the blizzard, would they retreat back to the safety of their business arrangement, or would they find the courage to acknowledge the love that had been forged between them? The rising action unfolded in a series of near misses and unspoken conversations. Jed would enter the kitchen for coffee in the morning, and the air would become so thick with unspoken feelings that they could barely look at each other. He would watch her from across the yard, a look of profound longing on his face, only to turn away abruptly when she caught his eye. Mrs. Abernathy, arriving to help with the weekly baking, took one look at the two of them and understood immediately. "A heart is not like cattle, child," she advised Lydia, her voice kind but firm as they kneaded dough together. "You can't keep it fenced in forever. Sooner or later, it'll break through." The external threat, however, was not finished with them. Croft, hearing of their successful trip to Cheyenne, grew more desperate. He couldn't attack them financially anymore, so his tactics became more direct. He and his men diverted a small tributary upstream, poisoning the water source for a section of the Pendleton pasture. It was a cruel, destructive act of spite. The climax arrived not with a whimper, but with a roar of frustrated grief. When Jed discovered the poisoned creek and the sick cattle, something inside him snapped, but his anger was not directed at Croft. It was directed at himself. He stormed back to the house, his face a thunderous mask. "He will never stop," he said, his voice raw with a despair that terrified Lydia. "This is my fault. I bring trouble wherever I go." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that broke her heart. "Maybe it would be better for you, for this ranch, if I just left." This was the ultimate test. He was trying to protect her by abandoning her, falling back on his old pattern of running from loss. Lydia would not allow it. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a power that made him stop cold. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path to the door. "You are not leaving. Do you not understand? This isn't about the ranch anymore. It's about the fact that I don't want to face another day, another problem, another anything without you." Her own walls came down in a torrent of emotion. "I love you, Jedediah Stone." The resolution was the utter stillness that followed her declaration. Jed stared at her, his defenses shattered by the force of her words. He finally admitted the truth he had been fighting since the storm. "I love you too, Lydia," he confessed, his voice choked. "I think I have since you refused to be scared away. I was just afraid my past would destroy your future." "We will face it together," she insisted, her hands coming up to cup his face. The transition was a kiss that sealed their new reality. It wasn't a kiss of desperation like in the line shack, but one of conscious, deliberate choice. It was a promise. Jed did not return to his quarters above the stable that night. He stayed in the house, in the master bedroom, with his wife. Their partnership was no longer just about land. It was about life. And now, truly united, they were finally ready to end Croft's reign of terror for good. A promise had brought her here, but it was a love, tested by fire and forged in ice, that would keep her forever. The hook for this final chapter was the dawn of a new season. Spring was coming to Montana, a time of renewal, and with it came the final reckoning for Silas Croft and the ultimate fulfillment of the promise Lydia and Jed had made to each other. The setting expanded to encompass the entire Havenwood Creek Valley. The narrative moved from the intimate space of the ranch to the public forum of the town, where the final conflict would be resolved not in secret, but before the eyes of the community. The melting snow and the first green shoots of grass provided a backdrop of rebirth and hope. The characters were now fully realized. Lydia and Jed stood as a united, confident couple, no longer defined by their grief but by their shared strength. Croft, in contrast, was portrayed as increasingly isolated and desperate, his power waning as his tactics grew more reckless. The central conflict was to defeat Croft permanently, securing their home and future. This would not be a victory won by the gun, but by the combined power of community, truth, and the law. The rising action began with a plan. Armed with the knowledge of Croft's water poisoning, Jed and Lydia didn't just report it to the sheriff. They reached out to the other ranchers downstream who were also affected. For the first time, the small, independent ranchers of Havenwood Creek, long intimidated by Croft, found a common cause and a pair of leaders willing to stand up to him. They gathered evidence. Testimonies from ranchers Croft had bullied, discrepancies in land deeds Lydia had uncovered in Arthur's old files, and proof that Croft's men had purchased the poison used in the creek. They presented this mountain of evidence at a town meeting, a public forum where Croft could not use his usual backroom tactics. Cornered and exposed, Croft made his final, desperate move. Believing Lydia was the heart of the operation, the one who had given Jed a reason to fight, he had his men abduct her from the ranch while Jed was at the meeting. His plan was to use her as leverage to force Jed to sign over the deed to the Pendleton Stone Ranch. The climax was not a classic Western shootout, but a tense, strategic showdown. When Jed received the ransom note, he did not ride out alone in a blaze of glory. Instead, he deputized the very ranchers Croft had terrorized. They became a posse, a symbol of a community united against tyranny. They tracked Croft and his men to an old abandoned line cabin. Jed, using his knowledge of the terrain and his past as a scout, orchestrated a plan that was more about intelligence than brute force. They surrounded the cabin, using the landscape to their advantage, creating diversions that made their small group seem like a much larger force. Trapped, outmaneuvered, and with his hired guns seeing no profit in a fight against a dozen determined ranchers, Croft was forced to surrender without a single shot being fired in anger. Lydia was rescued, safe and unharmed. The resolution was swift. With Croft and his men in custody and a mountain of evidence against them, their reign of terror in Havenwood Creek was over. The federal marshal was called in, and Croft's empire, built on intimidation and fraud, was dismantled. The final transition was the story's true ending. Set 1 year later, it was a warm summer afternoon at the Pendleton Stone Ranch. The fields were green, the cattle were healthy, and the house was filled with the sounds of life. Lydia, her body full with their first child, stood on the porch, watching Jed as he patiently showed a now 13-year-old Finn how to properly shoe a horse. He looked up and saw her, and the smile he gave her was one of pure, unadulterated happiness. He walked up to the porch, his limp barely noticeable anymore, and wrapped her in his arms. "Arthur would be proud of what we've built," Lydia said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "He'd be proud of you," Jed corrected, his hand resting gently on her belly. "You're the one who brought the life back to this place, Lydia. You brought it back to me." The wind, the constant, ever-present wind of the valley, swept down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers and the promise of a peaceful future. Lydia had come to Montana seeking a home and had found it, not just in the land Arthur had left her, but in the heart of the man who had promised to protect her. A promise kept, a love won, and a future as vast and hopeful as the Montana sky, stretching out before them.